The year was 2347, and humanity had finally earned its place among the stars. After decades of proving themselves as a spacefaring species, humans had been invited to join the Galactic Council. This was a gathering of over 40 alien civilizations that met to discuss peace and trade, and the many threats that lurked in the darkness between worlds. The meeting took place aboard a massive space station called the Citadel of Stars. It floated in neutral space, far from any, and served as a place where species that might otherwise be enemies could speak as equals. The station was enormous, larger than most cities on Earth, and its corridors were filled with beings of every shape and size imaginable. Commander Cole stood among the human delegation and tried not to stare at the aliens around him. At 34 years old, he had seen many strange things in his career with the Earth fleet. He had fought pirates in the asteroid belt and rescued colonists from dying ships, but nothing had prepared him for this. A creature with 6 legs and a body like flowing water glided past him. A being made entirely of light flickered in and out of existence near the window. 2 aliens that looked like walking trees whispered to each other in a language that sounded like wind through leaves. Was not a diplomat, he was a soldier, and he was here because the Earth government wanted protection for their ambassadors. His uniform was crisp and his posture was straight, but inside he felt like a child at his first day of school. Everything was new and overwhelming. Ambassador Hayes led the human delegation. She was a calm woman in her 50s with grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had spent 30 years for this moment, learning alien languages and customs and political systems. She moved through the crowd with confidence, greeting other diplomats and making small talk as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Stayed close to her along with his 2 officers. Lieutenant Maria was small but fierce, with dark hair pulled back in a tight braid. She had served with for 6 years and he trusted her with his life. Lieutenant Carlos was tall and quiet, the kind of man who noticed everything and said little. Together, the 3 of them formed a protective triangle around the ambassador. The Empire had sent their own delegation, and they drew attention wherever they went. They were one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. They had conquered half of known space before humans had even discovered fire. Their technology was advanced beyond anything Earth could imagine, and their warriors were said to be unbeatable in combat. Princess Han led the delegation. She was tall and slender, with pale blue skin that seemed to glow faintly in the station's lights. Her hair was silver and fell past her shoulders like liquid moonlight. Her eyes burned amber, the of dying stars, and they held an expression of permanent boredom, as if everything around her was beneath her notice. She was beautiful in a cold and distant way, like a statue carved from ice, and she clearly thought very little of the humans. The council session lasted for hours. Representatives from dozens of species spoke about trade agreements and border disputes and the ever-present threat of the Void Reapers. These were hostile creatures from the dark spaces between galaxies, monsters that attacked without warning and showed no mercy. Several colony worlds had been destroyed in recent years, and the council was trying to coordinate. When the session finally ended, the delegates mingled in the Great Hall. This was when the real politics happened. Ambassador Hayes had explained. Formal speeches were just for show. The true agreements were made in quiet conversations over drinks. Was standing near a window, watching a warship drift past the station, when Princess approached him. Her guards flanked her on either side, tall warriors in gleaming armor who looked at like he was an insect. "So you are one of the humans," said. Her translator device rendered her words in perfect English, but her tone made it clear she was not impressed. "I have read about your species. You are very young. Your civilization has existed for barely a cosmic heartbeat." "We are still learning, Your Highness," replied carefully. Ambassador Hayes had warned him to be polite to everyone, especially the learning, laughed, and it sounded like chiming crystals. "That is one way to describe it. I have studied your history, human. Your species is defined by violence against your own kind. Wars and genocides and petty conflicts over resources you could have shared. You spent centuries killing each other before you even looked at the stars." Felt anger rising in his chest but kept his face neutral. "Every species has a complicated past, Princess. We have grown beyond our worst impulses." "Have you?" She looked at his uniform, at the medals on his chest, at the weapon at his hip. "You bring soldiers to a peace summit. You cannot even attend a diplomatic function without weapons. This tells me everything I need to know about your people." Ambassador Hayes had noticed the conversation and was making her way over, but was not finished. "I have seen recordings of human soldiers in combat," she continued. "They scream and cry when they are wounded. They call out for their mothers when death approaches. They break under pressure and flee from danger." She shook her head slowly, her silver hair swaying. "They do not fear death. We embrace it as the final, but humans cling to life like parasites. You are weak." Met her amber eyes without flinching. "With respect, Princess, courage is not measured by the age of one's species." Courage stepped closer and her guards tensed. You speak of courage as if it was something humans possess. Your kind does not know the meaning of the word. You have never faced true darkness. You have never stood against horrors that would shatter your fragile minds. Fought the machine wars before your ancestors crawled from the oceans. We have seen things that would drive humans insane with fear. Perhaps you have not met the right humans, said quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps that this small creature from a young world would dare to challenge her. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, alarms began throughout the station. Red lights flashed on every surface. A mechanical voice announced an emergency in a dozen different languages. Through the massive windows could see shapes emerging from the darkness of space, ships unlike anything he had ever seen, black vessels that seemed to absorb light itself, their hulls covered in strange organic growths that pulsed like living flesh. The Void Reapers had arrived, and the Citadel of Stars was under attack. Chaos erupted throughout the station as the attack began. Diplomats screamed and ran in every direction, their guards trying desperately to protect them. The Great Hall became a sea of panicking bodies, aliens of every species pushing and shoving to reach the exits. Grabbed Ambassador Hayes by the arm. "Ma'am, we need to get you to the emergency bunker, now." She, her face pale but her voice steady, led the way. "Commander." Turned to his officers. "Are with me, we're moving." They pushed through the crowd, forming a protective wall around the ambassador. Could feel the station shaking beneath his feet as explosions rocked the outer hull. Through the windows he caught glimpses of the battle outside. The Allied fleets were scrambling to respond, but the Reapers had caught them by surprise. Ships were already burning in the void. Princess stood near the center of the hall, watching the chaos with wide eyes. Her guards surrounded her, but they seemed uncertain. Their warships were docked at the far end of the station, and the Reapers had already begun cutting through the hull in multiple locations. "The boarding parties will be inside within minutes," one of her guards said. "We must retreat to the vessel." "The docking bay is compromised," another guard replied. "Reaper ships have attached to that section." Heard this exchange as he passed. He hesitated for just a moment, then changed direction. Commander asked, "Change of plans. We need to secure the council chambers. That's where they'll set up a defensive position." Ambassador Hayes understood immediately. "You want to protect everyone, not just our delegation." "Yes, ma'am." She smiled despite the fear in her eyes. "That's why I brought you." They reached the council chambers just as the first Reaper boarding craft burned through the station's hull. The sound was terrible, a shrieking of metal that seemed to go on forever. Then came silence, and that was somehow worse. Had studied the Void Reapers in military briefings. He had seen recordings of their attacks, but nothing had prepared him for seeing them in person. They came through the breach like shadows given form, tall skeletal creatures encased in biomechanical armor that seemed to grow from their flesh. Their faces were smooth and featureless except for a single glowing eye in the center of their foreheads. That eye tracked movement with predatory precision, and wherever it looked, death followed. Their weapons fired bolts of dark energy that did not simply kill, they erased. A guard was hit and his body simply ceased to exist, leaving nothing behind but a faint shimmer in the air. "Take positions," shouted. "Use the furniture for cover, aim for the eye." He and his officers had grabbed weapons from the station's emergency armory on their way to the chambers. Standard pulse rifles, nothing special, but they would have to do. They overturned tables and used the heavy council seats as barricades, creating a defensive line at the main entrance. Several guards had followed them, including Princess. She had refused to hide in the bunker with the other diplomats, though was not sure if this was courage or pride. "First time fighting Reapers?" asked the nearest warrior. The alien, his purple skin had gone pale. "We have only heard stories. They are monsters from the void. They cannot be killed." "Everything can be killed," replied. "You just have to find the right way." The first wave hit them hard. The Reapers moved than creatures their size should have been able to move, and their weapons were devastating. 3 guards died in the first exchange, erased from existence before they could even fire their weapons. But and his team stood their ground. They had been in combat before, they had faced death before, and they had learned that panic was the true enemy, not whatever was trying to kill you. Stay calm, stay focused, trust your training. Fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. She moved from cover to cover, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted. Anchored the left flank, his rifle steady despite the chaos around him, and was everywhere, directing fire, pulling wounded to safety, filling gaps in the line whenever they appeared. Princess watched from behind a pillar, her amber eyes wide with something that might have been shock. The humans were not running, They were not screaming or crying or calling for their mothers. They were fighting with a cold efficiency that she had never seen from any species. A Reaper broke through the barricade and charged directly at. It was almost on top of her before she could react, its claws raised to tear her apart. But she did not freeze, she did not flee. She drew a combat knife from her belt and met the creature head-on, ducking under its first strike and driving the blade into a gap in its armor. The Reaper screamed, a sound that hurt to hear, and collapsed. Their joints called out, "The armor is weak at the joints." The tide of battle shifted. The defenders began targeting the gaps in the Reaper armor and the creatures started falling. They were not invincible after all. They could be hurt, they could be killed. The fight lasted 23 minutes. By the end, the entrance to the council chambers was littered with Reaper bodies, and the emergency blast doors had been sealed. The surviving defenders slumped against the walls, exhausted but alive. Leaned against a pillar, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. His uniform was torn and his hands were shaking from adrenaline. Had taken a hit to his shoulder but was already bandaging it himself, was checking on the wounded, applying first aid where she could. Princess approached slowly. Her face held an expression he had not seen before, confusion perhaps, or the beginning of respect. "You did not run," she said. "No, agreed, we didn't. Your officers are wounded, you are wounded. The rational choice would have been to retreat." Looked at her with tired eyes. "Where I come from, we don't leave people behind, not our friends, not our allies, and not even people who think we're beneath them." Was silent for a long moment, then she spoke and her voice was different now, quieter, more humble. "I have seen warriors flee from lesser threats. I have seen ancient species surrender to avoid pain, but you humans stood your ground against creatures that have destroyed entire worlds." She shook her head slowly. "I do not understand." "There's nothing to understand," said. "We were scared, we fought anyway, that's all courage really is." Before could respond, the station shook again, the lights flickered overhead, and through the sealed blast doors they could hear the Reapers gathering for another assault. The battle was far from over. The Citadel of Stars was dying. The Void Reaper assault had crippled the station's main power systems, and life support was failing sector by sector. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim red glow that made the corridors look like the inside of a dying heart. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and frost was beginning to form on the walls. The surviving council members and their guards had gathered in the central hub. This was a fortified section of the station that could be sealed off from the rest, with its own backup systems and emergency supplies. There were perhaps 200 beings present now, diplomats and soldiers and station staff from a dozen different species, all huddled together in the cold red light. And outside the sealed doors, the Reapers waited. They had stopped their assault for now, but everyone knew it was temporary. The creatures were regrouping, their numbers for a final push that would overwhelm the defenders and slaughter everyone inside. It was only a matter of time. Stood before a holographic map of the station, studying the enemy positions. The display flickered and sparked, damaged by the power fluctuations, but he could see enough. The Reapers had taken control of most of the station. Their ships were attached to the hull like parasites, and their forces were spread throughout the corridors and chambers. Stood beside him, his shoulder bandaged but his eyes clear, was checking their remaining ammunition for the third time, her expression growing grimmer with each count. "We have maybe 6 hours before they breach the hub," said quietly. "The Allied fleets are engaged with the Reaper warships outside. They can't break through to evacuate us." "So we die here," one of the guards said. He was young, barely more than a boy by his species standards, and his voice trembled, "Fighting to the last." "That's one option," agreed, "but I've never been fond of dying." He pointed to a section of the map. The station's reactor core was located on the far side of the structure, deep in Reaper-controlled territory. It was a massive chamber that housed the antimatter containment systems that powered the entire Citadel. "If we can reach the reactor core, we might be able to overload the emergency power systems. The resulting electromagnetic pulse would disable every electronic system within 50. That includes the Reaper boarding ships and their ground forces. Their armor, their weapons, even their own bodies are partially electronic. A pulse that strong would shut them all down." "That is a suicide mission," Princess said. She had been standing at the edge of the group, listening. "The reactor core is on the far side of the station. You would have to travel through of Reaper-controlled corridors." "Yes, sir. One person cannot fight through that many enemies. 3 people cannot. Even 10 would not be enough." "Probably not," admitted, "but someone has to try." The room fell silent. The various alien species looked at each other, but none volunteered to speak. The fear in the room was thick enough to taste. These were diplomats and politicians, not warriors. They had spent their lives talking about conflicts, not fighting in them. Then stepped forward. "I will go with you." Raised an eyebrow. "Princess, with respect, this isn't your fight. Your guards can escort you somewhere safer." "There is nowhere safer. The Reapers will breach this hub eventually and everyone here will die." She lifted her chin and something fierce burned in her amber eyes. "I have spent my entire life believing that humans were weak and inferior creatures. Tonight I watched 3 of you hold a position against dozens of Reapers while warriors from ancient species fled." She looked at the guards, some of whom had the decency to look ashamed. "If I am to die, I would rather die learning the truth than live believing a lie." Studied her for a long moment. "Can you fight?" In response, drew a weapon from beneath her diplomatic robes. It was a slender blade that with energy, its edge glowing faintly blue. "I was trained in combat since I could walk, Commander. I am the finest warrior in the Empire. My ancestors conquered 1,000 worlds with blades like this." "Then let's go save everyone," said. They set out 20 minutes later, led the way, followed by and came next, her energy blade ready, and behind her came 2 guards who had found their courage. One was the young guard named who had spoken earlier. The other was an older warrior named who had served the royal family for decades. 6 beings against an army of nightmares. They moved through maintenance corridors and access shafts, avoiding the main passageways where Reaper patrols were. His instincts guided them through the darkness, a sense developed through years of combat that told him when danger was near. He moved like a ghost, silent and careful, and the others followed his lead. The station was a maze of destruction. Bodies lay in the corridors, beings of species could not name who had been caught by the Reapers. Some had been killed quickly, others had not been so fortunate. He tried not to look at them too closely. During a brief rest in a sealed compartment, sat beside him. Her breathing was heavy, and fear showed in her eyes despite her attempts to hide it. "You are not afraid," she said, making it sound like an accusation. "I'm terrified," admitted, "but fear and courage aren't opposites, Princess. Courage is what you do when you're afraid. The belief that fear is weakness. We are taught to eliminate it from ourselves through meditation and training." Shook his head. "Then you're missing the point. Fear keeps you alive. It tells you when something is dangerous. The trick is not to let it control you." "And how do you prevent that?" He thought about it for a moment. "I think about the people I'm fighting for, my family back on Earth, my friends, the people in that hub who are counting on us." He met her eyes in the dim light. "When you have something worth protecting, it's easier to be brave." Was quiet for a long time after that. 2 hours into their journey, they encountered a Reaper hunting party that could not be avoided. 6 of the creatures blocked the corridor ahead, their single eyes scanning for prey. There was no other route, they would have to fight. Gave silent signals to his team. They had done this before, they knew what to do. The battle was brutal and close. In the narrow corridor there was no room for tactics, only violence. Pulse rifles fired and energy blades slashed and Reaper claws tore through armor. The noise was deafening. Fell first, a Reaper caught him with its claws and opened his chest before anyone could help. He died without making a sound, still fighting even as his life drained away. Took another wound, this time to his leg, but he kept shooting. Moved like water, flowing around attacks and striking at weak points, and was a blur of motion, her blade cutting through Reapers with a skill that was almost beautiful to watch. Saw something in her fighting that he recognized. She was not just fighting the Reapers, she was fighting herself, fighting the prejudices she had carried her whole life, fighting the arrogance that had blinded her to the truth about other species. When the last Reaper fell, they stood in the corridor surrounded by bodies, was tending to while kept watch, stared down its body, her face unreadable. "He served my family for 40 years, she said quietly. "He taught me how to hold my first blade." "I'm sorry," said. "Do not be sorry, he died fighting, that is what he would have wanted." She looked at with eyes that glistened. "We must make sure he did not die for nothing." They pressed on. The reactor core was a cathedral of technology. The chamber stretched upward into darkness, its walls lined with massive power conduits that with barely restrained energy. In the center of the room, suspended by magnetic fields, was the antimatter containment unit. It glowed with a soft blue light that was almost peaceful, hiding the destructive power it held within. The Reapers had made this their command center. At least 30 of the creatures filled the chamber, clustered around control consoles and communication arrays. Among them moved several larger variants that recognized from intelligence briefings. Reaper primes, command units that directed the others through some kind of psychic link. They were bigger than the regular Reapers, their armor thicker, their single eyes burning with cold intelligence. Surveyed the situation from a maintenance catwalk high above the chamber floor. The others crouched beside him, barely breathing. One sound and they would be discovered. "We cannot fight through that," whispered, "not with 5 of us." "We don't have to fight all of them," replied, "just the ones between us and the main control console. If we can trigger the overload sequence, the electromagnetic pulse will shut down everything, including the Reapers." And us pointed out that much electromagnetic energy will fry our equipment, maybe our nervous systems too. "I know," limped closer, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes determined. "So what's the plan, Commander?" Pointed to a series of power conduits running along the far wall. "You're going to create a distraction, use the last of our explosives to rupture those conduits when the Reapers move to investigate, and will provide covering fire from up here." He turned to, "You and I are going to reach that console." "That is not a plan," said. "That is a list of ways to die." "Got a better idea?" She was silent. "Then we go with mines." They moved into position, felt the familiar calm settling over him, the clarity that came before combat. His heartbeat slowed, his vision sharpened, every detail of the chamber became clear, the positions of the enemies, the angles of cover, the distance to the console. He had been in impossible situations before. He had survived when logic said he should have died, but this felt different, this felt final, not because he was afraid but because he had accepted what might happen. He was at peace with it. Gave him a look before she moved out. "Beanan, sir. Don't start with the goodbyes, Lieutenant. I expect you to buy me a drink when this is over." She smiled, a flash of warmth in the darkness. "You're buying. I saved your ass twice today." "Fair enough." The explosives detonated with a thunderous roar that shook the entire chamber. The power conduits ruptured and sent arcs of blue energy cascading across the walls and floor. The Reapers reacted exactly as had predicted, moving toward the disturbance to assess the threat. He and dropped from the catwalk together. They fell 20 feet and landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact, then sprinting toward the console. Above them and opened fire, their pulse rifles sending bolts of energy into the Reaper ranks. A Reaper Prime spotted their approach. It let out a shriek that seemed to vibrate in spoons, a sound that was part scream and part signal. It charged toward them, moving than something that size should have been able to move. Its claws were extended and its eye burned with predatory hunger. Intercepted it, her blade met its claws in a shower of sparks, and the force of the impact drove her backward. But she held her ground, matching the Prime strike for strike. "Go," she shouted, "I will hold it." Ran behind him, he could hear the sounds of battle, pulse rifle fire from above, the hum of blade, the screams of dying Reapers, and underneath it all the steady hum of the reactor waiting to be unleashed. He reached the console and began working. His fingers flew over controls he barely understood, pulling up menus and searching for the overload sequence. The station's computer system was damaged but still functional. It responded to his commands slowly, lag and corruption making every action take twice as long as it should have. A warning flashed on the screen. Overload will result in catastrophic electromagnetic pulse. Estimated radius 50. All electronic systems within range will be permanently disabled. "That's the idea," muttered. He heard cry out and turned to see her fall. The Reaper Prime had landed a blow that sent her sprawling across the floor. Her blade clattered from her hand and slid out of reach. The creature stood over her with claws raised for a killing blow, its eye fixed on her with cold satisfaction. Did not think, he drew his sidearm and fired. The shot struck the Prime directly in its eye, and the creature staggered backward with a shriek of pain. It was not dead, but it was blind, stumbling and thrashing as it tried to locate its attacker. More Reapers were coming, drawn by the commotion. A dozen of them at least, converging on the console from every direction, had gone silent above, either dead or out of ammunition, was still firing, but his shots were becoming less frequent. Turned back to the console. The overload sequence was ready, all he had to do was activate it. He looked at, she had retrieved her blade and was back on her feet, but she was bleeding from a deep gash across her arm. She met his eyes and once, she understood what was about to happen. "Everyone down," shouted, "get to cover now." He slammed his palm on the activation control. The console beeped once, acknowledging his command. A countdown began, 60 seconds. Ran to and grabbed her arm. She leaned on him heavily, her strength finally failing. Together they stumbled toward the nearest doorway, a maintenance access that led away from the chamber. "You came back for me," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I was nothing but cruel to you when we first met. I mocked you and your entire species, and you came back for me." "That's what we do," said. "Now move." They made it through the doorway just as the Reapers reached the console. The creatures screamed in rage, their claws scraping against the sealed door, but they could not stop what had been set in motion. The countdown reached 0. The world turned white. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from the reactor core like a silent explosion. It swept through the station and beyond, an invisible wave of energy that destroyed everything electronic in its path. Lights died, computers crashed, life support systems failed. And the Reapers fell. Their biomechanical bodies could not survive without the electronic systems that kept them alive. They collapsed where they stood, their single eyes going dark. On the ships attached to the station's hull, the same thing happened. Weapons went offline, engines died, the Reaper fleet became nothing but drifting wreckage. In the maintenance corridor and lay on the cold floor, the lights were gone. The only illumination came from emergency chemical strips that activated automatically when the power failed. They were alive. Did it work? Asked. Listened, the silence was absolute, no more screaming, no more weapons fire, no more Reapers. It worked, he said. And then exhaustion claimed him, and everything went dark, woke to the sound of voices, human voices speaking English. For a moment he thought he was back on Earth, lying in his childhood bed with his mother calling him for breakfast. Then the pain hit him and reality came flooding back. He was lying on a medical bed in some kind of field hospital. Bright lights hung overhead, and the air smelled of antiseptic and recycled oxygen. People in uniforms moved around him, checking equipment and tending to other patients. He's awake, someone said. A face appeared above him. She had a bandage wrapped around her head and her arm was in a sling, but she was smiling. That crooked smile that always meant things had worked out somehow. Welcome back, Commander. You've been out for 3 days. 3 days, tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through his body from a dozen different places he had not even known were injured. Easy, the medics said you had a concussion, 4 broken ribs, internal bleeding and enough bruises to paint a sunset. You're lucky to be alive. Both made it, lost his leg but they say they can grow him a new one. Took a hit to the chest but the armor saved him. Smile faded slightly. We lost Ambassador Hayes. A Reaper got through to the bunker before the pulse hit. She died protecting 2 children from some species I can't pronounce. Closed his eyes. Hayes had been a good woman. She had believed in humanity's place among the stars more than anyone he had ever known. The council members. Most survived. The pulse took out every Reaper on the station and in the surrounding fleet. The Allied ships were able to break through and evacuate everyone. The Reapers retreated once their command structure was destroyed. Leaned closer. You're a hero, the human who saved the Galactic Council. They're already writing songs about you on 6 different worlds. I don't feel like a hero. That's usually how it works. Over the following days, learned the full extent of what had happened. The electromagnetic pulse had disabled not only the Reapers but also most of the station's systems. 214 beings had died in the attack, including 43 humans. The Citadel of Stars would have to be completely rebuilt. But the Council had survived, the Alliance held, and for the first time in the history of relations, humanity was being looked at differently. Where there had been condescension and dismissal before, there was now curiosity and respect. The humans had proven themselves not through conquest or displays of technological might, but through the simplest and most profound act of all. They had stood their ground when it mattered. Princess came to visit him on the 5th day. She walked with a slight limp and her arm was still bandaged, but otherwise she looked recovered. She was wearing simple clothes instead of her royal finery, and something in her face had changed. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something softer, wiser. She sat in the chair beside his bed and was quiet for a long moment. I am going to change things, she finally said. When I return to the Empire, I am going to tell my people what I saw, what I learned. My species has been arrogant for too long. We have looked down on younger civilizations as if age were the same as worth. We were wrong. That's a big job, said. Yes, but I have learned that big jobs are not impossible. I watched 3 humans hold a defensive position against overwhelming odds. I watched you run towards certain death to save people who were nothing to you. I watched your officer take a blade meant for an alien she had never met. Shook her head slowly. These things should not have been possible, but they happened anyway. She reached out and took his hand. Her skin was cool against his, smooth and faintly luminescent. You asked me once how to be brave when you are afraid. I understand now. It is not about eliminating fear. Fear is natural. Fear is necessary. Bravery is about having something worth facing that fear for. She squeezed his hand gently. My people have forgotten that lesson. We have become so concerned with our reputation and now that we have forgotten what truly matters. You have reminded me. Did not know what to say, so he said nothing, and they sat together in comfortable silence. When she left, she paused at the door and looked back at him. I hope our species can be allies from this day forward, perhaps even friends. There is much we can learn from each other. "I'd like that," said. She smiled then, and it was not the cold smile of a princess looking down on lesser beings. It was warm and genuine, and perhaps a little bit shy. "Goodbye, Cole, until we meet again." "Goodbye." He returned to Earth 3 weeks later. There were ceremonies and medals and speeches that he did not care about. Politicians wanted to shake his hand, and journalists wanted to interview him, and strangers on the street wanted to thank him for what he had done. He tried to tell them that he was not special, that any human would have done the same thing in his place, that courage was not about being fearless or immortal or ancient. It was about standing up when it mattered, fighting for those who could not fight for themselves, and never giving up no matter how bad things looked. Some of them understood, most did not. But the galaxy had changed. Humanity had proven something that night on the Citadel of Stars. They had shown that a young species from a small blue world could stand shoulder to shoulder with the civilizations in existence. They had shown that courage came not from power or experience but from the heart. And somewhere across the stars, a princess was telling that story to her people, telling them about the humans who did not run, about the warriors who faced their fear and fought anyway, about a species that had only existed for a cosmic heartbeat but had already learned the most important lesson in the universe. That it was not how long you lived that mattered, it was what you did with the time you had. Stood at the window of his apartment and looked up at the night sky. Somewhere out there among all those distant stars, new challenges were waiting, new threats, new opportunities. He smiled. Humanity was ready.